All right, so today we are going to talk about three topics that maybe affect farms, particularly in developing countries, although this could be issues that also affect them in developed countries, maybe to a lesser extent. One of them is the difficulty to get contracts enforced by courts. The other, and sort of a consequence of that, is, well, in the absence of good enforcement of contract by courts, what takes place, what can help. And so one of them is reputation. And so we're going to spend some good amount of time talking about reputation. And then the other that you could do is to try and substitute formal institution, like courts and formal contracts, etc., with more informal institution like networks. So that's kind of the game plan for today. So the basic problem that I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence for is that legal systems are not very good. So that means that contracts are hard to enforce. I'll show you evidence of that in a minute coming from the bank. And it's believed to be worse in developing countries. So for a while, the World Bank, in particular, Simeon Djankov, who was then at the bank, subsequently became a politician in Bulgaria and now is back in the bank, was pushing a lot, in particular with Andrei Schleifer. They were trying to collect data for how easy or difficult it is to enforce a contract in a range of countries, and then sort of arguing that it's important, although the academic work only find lukewarm support for the fact that there is a correlation between contract enforcement and GDP. But what came out of this, and is something that the bank continues to do, is a doing business report, where they try to collect better data on how easy to enforce a contract. So in one of them, I think they were trying to recover, how long it would take. So they were basically taking a test case. So how long it would take to recover a bounce check, for example. And then they were talking to lawyers and to business people in developing countries and getting answer on this particular question. So something that's a little bit more concrete and specific than what institutions like Transparency International do, which is to go and find like 5 people in the country and get their opinion on how corrupt the place is. So this was much more focused, and one of them is like how easy it is to kick out a tenant that doesn't want to be kicked out, or how easy it is to register your farm to become a formal farms, or how easy it is to recover the bounce check. So, and then you rank them. So the best country is Luxembourg, and then India and East Timor are some of the worst countries where it would be the most difficult to recover, to make contract enforced. You can see that France is not doing too bad, which is unusual, because usually they somehow don't like either France or anybody who has a French legal system. But that's a story for another time. So, but just looking at this, you can see that in the top countries, mostly you find quite rich countries. With interesting example of Korea, which of course is rich today, but wasn't always rich. And they probably would make some causal thing out of this. And in this, you have mainly poor countries. Some of them, of course, at the time of this in complete jeopardy, like Central African Republic or Syria. Some of them, being largely functional country like India, but still a place where enforcing a contract would be very difficult. So this is the average time to enforce your contract, where again you can see that in the OECD high-income country. So this is 3 types of contract. This is 3 types of things that you need to do. You need to file, you need to have a trial, and then you need to have enforcement. And all of this, so for example, in India, you might get a judgment against, say you are a creditor, you want to recover your assets, you might get a judgment against the person, but you'll never get any. So that itself is going to take some time. And then even after that is done, you won't be able to recover the asset. The best that could happen is that you have a padlock on the company, so the person cannot use the asset, but you cannot recover it either. So all of these dimensions might take longer in developing countries. So South Asia is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. You can see that trial and judgment takes a long time, enforcement takes a long time. And then after that, you might also recover less of your claim. So it might cost more of your claim to recover the thing. So in Norway, it's going to cost you 9% of the actual cost of a claim on average to recover it. So this is the legal fees. So again, Luxembourg was high before, it's high now. Norway, Korea, the countries that where in general it's not, contract enforcement is good, it's fast and it's not very expensive. And then I'm surprised to not see our friend India in there, but Timor is there, where again it would cost 163% of the claim to recover the claim. That after a large number of days. So whether or not you want to start in this venture is, let's say, ambiguous to say the least. And of course that creates in turn incentives for your potential trading partners to not behave well. And in turn that creates incentive for you to not deal with the trading partner, since you're not going to get enforcement of the... So that's a little bit of background. A nice little paper that provides more sort of, in a sense, more anecdotal evidence of that, but in another hand, also more precise evidence of that. That's for India, which doesn't look great by this metric. This is a paper by Rajkamal Iyer and Antoinette Shaw. And what they do is that they hire a bunch of small entrepreneurs, like 100 or so, who are not in the pen trading, in the pen sector, for reasons that are going to be obvious in a minute. So they are, various things. They are used to deal in an entrepreneurial settings to conduct a sort of audit study. So basically, they ask them to contact wholesalers to contract for pens. So let's say, and then the pens can either be just pens. You say, I need 10,000 pens, or I need 10,000 pens with a PSE written on it. So they have two kinds of pens that are custom printed, like Paris School of Economics, pens that are just generic. So they are basically asking those entrepreneurs to contact wholesalers. So this is like an audit study. They contact real wholesalers to arrange for these pens. And then what the wholesalers do is that they are going to find pen producers somewhere in India. This takes place in Chennai, so probably somewhere in and around Chennai, and get the pen, procure the pen, get the pen produced, and then give them to the entrepreneur who has requested them. So that's the audit study. So why do they randomize whether or not they? So maybe I'll tell you what they do next. So then after that, their first interest in is what are the terms of the contract that is being offered to the buyer. How much do they need to pay upfront, and what is the price gonna be, given that the production cost is the same, probably for a generic, it's almost the same for a generic pen and a printed pen, how the prices are going to vary, etc. And then they also, ex post, they also try to renegotiate. So they call them, they say, I want to get this pen, they get an initial contract with a price and when they need to pay. And a few weeks later, they come back and say, oh, I'm so sorry, my buyer has pulled, PSC called me back. After all, they don't want these pens. So I don't want them anymore. And then they see how the wholesaler is reacting. Are they trying to bargain them down on the price? Are they hanging the phone on them? Are they negotiating in a way or another? So that's that's the study. So why did they vary the generic versus custom printed pen? Why is it an interesting dimension of variability?
Yeah. Because with custom printed pens you cannot switch it. I mean, you cannot sell it to another person.
Exactly. So with custom printed pen, the outside value of the good is essentially 0. So if you cannot, so of course, in a system where the court system would work, they could kind of recover the value of the contract. They have a contract, they could recover the value of the contract. But if you can, if the court are not working, so if contracts are somehow are not complete or are not enforceable, the ability of someone who orders printed pen to hold up is very high, because basically the wholesaler is on the hook for a bunch of printed pens. Okay, so the hold up ability in the Grossman-Hart type of framework is much higher with printed pen than with custom pen. So there might be an interesting variation there. All right, so that's what we're looking at. So first thing is, they call them on the phone. What's the initial price that's offered for a printed pen versus a custom pen? And so the control here is custom. And you can see that the initial price is much higher, 43% higher for printed pen than for custom, than for generic pens. So they basically want more money. Of course, part of this is the cost of production is a bit higher, but it's much higher than the cost of production, which might be 2 or 3% higher. So they want more money. And that again, that already suggests that there is something about contracts not being enforceable, because in a world where contracts are enforceable, it wouldn't matter, the ability to hold up would be 0. Okay? So they want more money. After negotiation, they still get more money. And so the final price contracted is basically the people who made the phone call to pose as the people who needed the pen were asked to try and negotiate and get the best prices that they would have gotten. Then importantly, they also want more money upfront when it's a custom pen than when it's a generic pen. So they want the mean is about they want 54%. No, it's like, I think this without control is easier. 19% upfront, and they want about almost 3 times as much, yeah, exactly 3 times as much, from 19% to 19 plus 38 in the case of printed pen. So again, like if you cannot. If there is a risk to be held up, then you just want as much as your money to start with as possible. So that's again an indication that they don't expect the contract to be enforced. Now, what happens in case of renegotiation? So they call the number, they call 75 people, 75 of those wholesalers, and try to get to renegotiate the order. So again, the argument being the final customer has pulled, so I don't need the pens anymore. On average, 34% of the 34, so about half, 60% of the pens are renegotiated. So 34 out of 75, that's the average. The renegotiation is more likely to work for printed pen than for non-printed pen. So ex post, it is in fact the case that if you come and say, look, I cannot, I don't want to buy you, I don't need the pens anymore, they are more likely to agree on sort of some reduced price in the case of the printed pen, because they have nothing to do with, the wholesaler has nothing to do with the printed pen. So that again corresponds to your ability to hold up and require a lower price ex post is higher in the case of the printed pen. So 60% of the printed pen are renegotiated, but only 32% of the generic pens. So in the generic pen, they are more likely to say just fuck off. I'm not renegotiating that pen. And so that's kind of the key results. That another key result is that in fact ex post they're right. So they will have their back to the wall. They will act in accordingly, and therefore they were right to ask more money upfront. Now another thing that's interesting is that when the renegotiation fail, actually they don't say what I just said. in many cases, they actually refund the upfront fee. So with a non-printed pen, they can actually go sell them. But of course, they could keep the upfront money and sell them. Now, they have these lots of pens. They already have the money. There is no way that the other person can fight them for the money, since they don't want the pens anymore. And still, in 15 out of the 25 cases where there was a renegotiation failure, they couldn't agree on a price, they just reimbursed the whole deposit. So why would they do that? Like, why would you give money that you don't have to give, given that you now have to go through the hassle of selling the pens?
Maybe if they want pen again in the future, they may want to ensure that the customer comes back.
Exactly. It's like in this case, they actually see, even though by definition, given the construction of the experiment, it's the first time they ever hear of this person, they see some value in preserving the relationship. So instead of just keeping the money and trying to sell the pen, they reimburse the money and try to sell the pen. So they take a pure loss compared to a very easy alternative. So that means that there is value in the relationship. Again, could be a consequence of a low contractual enforcement, is that you want to behave well, certainly much better than you need to, in the view of a possible relationship. So probably in these cases, in a lot of cases, they think maybe something did happen to the other guy, and they might contact me again. Why don't I just take the loss and hope to have a trading partner? So that's sort of a nice paper, kind of documenting in a more detailed way how the contracts that are written are very imperfectly enforced and what consequences it has. So in this condition, what do you enforce contracts if the courts are not going to do it most of the time? So one option is to do what these pen people did, which is invest in relationship and exploit repeated interactions, reputations, etc. Both in an individual relationship, so try to build a relationship and a reputation within a relationship, and then potentially collective reputations. And then the other thing you could do is to refuse, for example, to take any pen order from someone you don't know, and just work within networks. So the rest of today, what we are going to do is to talk about both of these teams. First, the reputation team and the network teams. And both are very, very important, both because I really do think that they condition a lot of how firms behave, and because they create, over and above what we've already discussed, for example, with the credit market, they create barriers to entry, for example, for someone who starts from scratch and therefore doesn't have a reputation. It becomes difficult to start to set up your operations. For someone who is not in a network, it becomes difficult to set up your operation. And therefore, I think those have very large consequences on the allocation of resources in equilibrium, the ability to take advantage of international trade and the like. So I think these are two very key topics. Until relatively recently, there was one theory model from Tirol that we are going to spend a lot of time on reputation, and a study on the software industry that I did with Abhijit, and that was it. Nobody was kind of so interested in reputation. But I think this has really changed in the last few years, where as people became more interested in firms, they also rediscovered the role of reputation, and you start having a lot of recent papers. So I'm going to mention some of them, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some of them, and some of them maybe you'll write. And with networks, again, networks are generally very fashionable in economics and in development these days. And since firms are fashionable, imagine a network of firms is like the kind of super hot area. where there is lots of interesting work, and I'm going to talk about some of them. So let me spend some time on the Tirol model. The Tirol model is written mainly thinking about corruption, but I think you can also think about it. You can think about it with thinking about any really relationship between firms as well. So I'm going to more frame it in this way, although if you read the paper, you will see it framed entirely on whether the agent is corrupt or not. So suppose that you have a buyer. So it's a slide in this presentation of the Tirol paper. If you then go to read it, you will not find a one-for-one correspondence. First, I am simplifying it. I'm taking the simplest assumption all the time. And second, the story that I'm telling is about a firm. So don't get surprised if you read the paper, which you should. There is going to be a slight mental translation that you need to operate. But for teaching, that works better. So suppose you have a buyer who wants one of two types of good, a red good or a white good. And the quality can be good or bad, which is observable. So you can know, once you've been given the red pen or the white pen, you know whether it's good or not, but it's not verifiable. So you cannot go to court. So the buyer has some payoffs. If the buyer orders red, he gets, and it's a good high quality red, he gets H. And if it's a low quality red, he gets D. And for white, if it's high quality white, he gets little h, and bad quality white, he gets little d. And the key point is that there is both the preferred thing is the high quality red, but then there is also more variance there, which is the least preferred one is the low quality red. And with the white wine, it's less bad. So the high quality white is less good than the high quality red, but the low quality white is better than the low quality red. And assume that the low quality white is worth getting, it's greater than 0, and assume that it's the buyer who makes the offers. So suppose that for supplier it's more expensive than to produce quality. So suppose it costs them big G to produce quality and 0 to produce the bad quality. And suppose that the efficient outcome is to produce high quality red in the sense that the value of the high quality red minus the cost is greater than producing the low quality white, which is cost 0. But on the other hand, the low quality white, the value of that is better than the high quality white minus G. So clearly, you're never going to produce high quality white. There's no reason. If you're going to produce white, that's going to be the low quality. So the supplier's outside option is getting 0 forever. And I'm going to show in a slide the one-shot game, but then after that we are going to assume that they continue to purchase, and then at some point the supplier dies, which happens with probability lambda every period. So if it was a one-shot game, I can even, let me not put the slide and ask you, if it was a one-shot game, what happens? If it's just a one-time, there is no history, and you are matched once and you order pens, or red, do you order red or white, and does the supplier produce high or low quality? Sorry?
I mean, nothing happens because the supplier has no interest in producing the good. So the buyer knows that and he will not buy.
So something happens, which is that, but it's a low quality that happens. So the supplier orders the white. The buyer orders the white. Sorry, the supplier produces low quality white, and he gets paid 0, which is its cost of producing low quality white. So in one-shot game, clearly, even though the efficient outcome is to produce red, high-quality red, what happens in reality is low-quality white. Okay, so that's happening. If you could have a repeated game and you could rematch all the time with the same, the buyer and the supplier kept rematching with each other, then you have the Folk theorem-like logic, which affords the possibility of a strategy that allows to keep the good equilibrium in place, meaning the production of red. So basically, you have a Grimm trigger strategy where you are the buyer always offers red, but to start with, offer red the first time and forever again until the supplier defaults and does low quality red, after which they will always buy white. Okay? So in that case, the punishment can sustain good behavior. The Folk theorem idea is that the punishment can sustain good behavior as long as the discounting is not too severe. So in this case, as long as your probability of being here in the next period is high enough. So with various prices, if the prices changed every period, what you need is that the value of the future relationship, assuming that you're going to behave well forever starting today, is greater than taking the price for the high quality today and instead not paying the cost and providing low quality. So that's your one-shot deviation, and that's the entire future. So if the prices are constant, it can be simplified, and it's to and so that's the relationship. So that's showing that as long as the chance of dying is not high enough, and as long as is not high enough, and as long as the cost of producing is not high enough, that equilibrium exists. And in particular, since the value for the seller is to pay up to big H, this equilibrium will exist as long as the chance of dying is less than 1 minus G over H. You obtain that by replacing P by H and doing some algebra. Okay? So as long as the probability of dying is low compared to the value, and the value for H must be, for the seller must be high, because this is under the bar and there is a minus here, and the cost must be low because there is a minus here and it's over the bar. So that's very intuitive, that's a one-shot view. Now what happens if you instead have lots of sellers, and suppose that since we are interested in reputation, we need to say it's a reputation for what? So here, it's a reputation for being a good, high-quality person. So for that, you need to have some high-quality guys and low-quality guys, and people who are opportunistic and could go one way or the other. So suppose you have a fraction alpha of honest guys, a fraction beta of dishonest guy. So no matter what, the honest guy will always produce high quality. No matter what, the dishonest guys will always produce low quality, as long as this is what they were contracted for. And then you have strategic, fraction gamma of strategic people who will do what's in their best interest. So how does this change the equilibrium? So again, with with just this permanent, with this matching where you're matched, you can continue the relationship with the same person forever once you've started, if you want to. The buyer will start by ordering high quality at a low price. The dishonest guys will produce low quality. The honest guy will produce high quality. And there is an equilibrium in which the strategic guys will produce high quality. So basically, they are agreeing to take a one-time loss to distinguish themselves from the dishonest guys and get a higher price ever after. So that's kind of a first. So you want to establish your. So this is a little bit like in the pen example where you suppose that it's not exactly the same setup, but that's the same logic, that you are willing to take a one-time loss to establish that you're a good guy and to remain in the pool of good guys, or to masquerade as a good guy and remain in the pool, so and continue like that. So this is the case where you're matched with someone, and after that the relationship will continue with that person forever again. Now, suppose that instead you are rematched every period. Then it's a little bit more complicated, because your investment in your reputation might or might not be useful. If you're rematched with someone else every period, and there is no way of conveying your history, then there is not too much point in establishing that in behaving well. So you're going to go back to behaving, all the strategic people will go back to behaving badly in the first period. If the probability to find out the history is 1, then you're going to behave like if you were matched with someone. It doesn't make a difference. But, and the interesting case is the one where the information exists but is not completely perfect. So if you behaved with low quality at least once in the past, your buyer finds out with some probability. So this X, which is a probability in which you find out that you've been providing low quality when contracted high quality, is the kind of a measure of how good the information is in an economy. So in this model, if you've supplied low quality once, a strategic seller supplies low quality once, their reputation is tainted. Someone is going to find out, and then once you've done it once, you will deviate forever. Then just fix the price at B for big B for the red and little b for the whites. Assume that's the price. So we are now looking at the incentive for strategic sellers to start with red and at the beginning of their life, given that this price, the price difference is fixed, X is whatever it is, and lambda is whatever it is. And what is interesting is that in that model, you can have multiple steady state if the parameters are just so. Of course, if lambda is very low, you're just going to have a bad equilibrium. If lambda is very high and X is very high, you might just get a good equilibrium. But with a range of probability of dying and information quality of information transmission, you are going to have you have a coexistence of steady states. In a good steady state, so here's one example of a good equilibrium. One seller orders red from any buyer with whom he is matched and on which he has he doesn't know that they have misbehaved in the past. Then if you've not misbehaved in the past, you're untainted, you could produce high quality red if X is high enough and the gap, the price difference is high enough. And knowing that, and the reason is that you know that as long as you never deviate, the next the sellers in the future will continue to offer you the high quality, so it's worthwhile not deviating, even though you would have a one-shot incentive. But once you've deviated, you're going to the pool of bad guys, and you'll have these lower things. So the same fault theorem logic will happen of taking the short-term loss in order to to continue having the benefit of being considered to be as someone who is likely to produce high quality. And knowing that, of course, is self-reinforced. The buyer will order red as long as there are enough untainted sellers, so he knows that when he's never heard of someone, he's likely to be to find it in his interest to behaving well. So that's the good equilibrium. And then the bad one is that suppose that instead in the future you think that starting from tomorrow the sellers will always want white. Then there is no point investing in quality today, because in the future you will ask to give white at low quality. So therefore, even if someone by chance offer you some red today, if you're a strategic guy, you're pocketing the money and providing low quality. Knowing that, the sellers are better off demanding white today. So in that group, so there could be these two equilibria. So why is that interesting? It's interesting because that creates this possibility of the history of the faults of your elders continuing to plague you. So you are the fact that your group collectively, take it now as a potential measure of discrimination. Collectively, your group is known to be tempted to produce low quality. And even though you might be a new member of the group, you haven't done anything bad yourself, but if your trading partner doesn't know whether you're young or whether you're old, they know that in general in your group there are a lot of tainted people, therefore there is no reason why they would treat you differently, therefore there is no reason why you would be treating differently. So that generates this possibility of a group reputation affecting the reputation of the newborn in that group, and hence their behavior, creating the self-fulfilling prophecy of some groups behaving and being treated differently than others. Or some countries, for example, acquiring a reputation for high-quality product versus others that will acquire the reputation of low-quality product, and it being very difficult to get out of it. So that's one way in which is important. The other thing that is that comes out of this model, which is useful, is that it also creates this persistence of bad shocks. So suppose that there is a one-time shock that suddenly everybody finds it very profitable to deviate. Suddenly it's very profitable to deviate in the short run for a reason or another. So it's a financial crisis, everybody is running on the bank, you default with everybody else. Now, it might be that after that the equilibrium, the good equilibrium goes away, because the proportion of tainted firms in the economy in this group is becoming so large that for the new people who get born, if not enough get born every period, the share of people who are not tainted is too low for it to be worthwhile for the firm to offer to buy red at the high quality, and therefore the good equilibrium never comes back. So it might come back. So the thing is that you will say, well, after enough period, everybody is dead of the group that had these collective sins and therefore is tainted. But the problem is that you cannot wait long enough, because for the new people, it might not be worth it to wait long enough. So as long as the probability of dying in every period is high enough, although they know that eventually all the bad people will be dead, and therefore they could just stick it, be patient and wait until they would finally be, all of the dead people, tainted people would disappear and the new people can leave the good equilibrium ever after. If that's too long, then that's not worth it. So it might not be possible to ever reinstate the good equilibrium. So a big scandal like tainted milk in China might produce this equilibrium where nobody is going to produce good milk ever again. So the key intuition is that the collective reputation is bad. The new untainted people cannot distinguish themselves, and they might not find it worthwhile if it's to wait long enough to not have. Then they become tainted themselves, and then that continues like that. A related implication is that if you wanted to do an anti-corruption crackdown, or high quality, a group could decide that from now on they are going to be to force each other to behave well in order to switch to the good equilibrium. The implication of this is that you might need to do it for a very long time. So a corruption crackdown, for example, or a good business relation crackdown, say China suddenly decides they want to move from being producing these low quality toys to produce high quality toys that are not going to poison children. So the government could decide that they're going to crack down on anybody who deviates from the very good, European norms on the super high quality toys. But if they do it just one time, that still leaves a lot of people from the previous generation who are tainted, and in the absence of, so suppose the crackdown is such that you're shot if you are producing the low quality, and of course in the short run even the tainted form will produce low quality. But as soon as that goes away, they'll go back to producing low quality because they are tainted anyway. So you need to do it. If you wanted to do this, you would need to do it long enough that all of the old guys are dead, in order to be able to switch to the good equilibrium where nobody is untainted. A few people are untainted, just the die-hard, dishonest guys are untainted, the other guys continue to do their work. So a crackdown on corruption might need to persist for a long period of time. Yeah.
Does this mean that the crackdown will only be efficient when people who benefit from such crackdown will wait it out anyway?
No, because the individual gains are lower than the collective gains. So it could be that if it could be beneficial to do a crackdown, there may well be a situation where it's just not beneficial. But there may be a situation where it is beneficial because there is an externality on every person who behaves well as an externality on everybody else that's not taken into account in their own calculation. Some sort of other implications. So one is that, so for example, going back to the example of international trade, where I think it's really pertinent. Some countries sometimes try and liberalize their economy to let in the import of the rich countries in exchange of having the chance to export towards the rich countries, and then nothing happens. And nothing happens because, so you would think, well, we've just removed all the barriers to trade. But the thing is, they still need to establish, there might be other barriers, like they don't know, like what we were discussing yesterday, is maybe they don't know how to produce the good drugs, etc. But there is also, even if they knew how to do it, they have no track record on doing it well, and therefore nobody is going to buy from them. I think it's very, very, very important thing to keep in mind in international trade as a constraint for developing countries to benefit from trade. And one reason, on top of others like learning by doing, comparative advantage, etc., while new entrants to the international trade will specialize in relatively low quality, high volume commodities. Another implication, of course, is the informational structure is critical for this model. So when it's very easy to find out what people have done in the past, then you might have just a good equilibrium, like in the setting, like in the model where you're always negotiating with the same person. And if X is very low, in contrast, you might have just a bad equilibrium because it is almost like a one-shot game without any transmission of information ever. So you have no incentive to build your reputation. So if there is one theory paper out of this that you want to look at, I think that's a very nice one to have in the back of your mind. Also, like any TRL paper, it's written to have the minimum set of assumptions to deliver the maximum number of results. So that's a good example for applied theory, given that your goal, if you are going to write applied theory, is that you want to have fewer assumptions than results. That looks obvious, but many applied theory papers have more assumptions than results. That's not one of them. These are very few assumptions for a lot of nice results. And it's a very good framework for thinking about some of these issues empirically. So some empirical implications that one might want to look at is that sellers may be willing to take a loss up front in order to establish a relationship. So So there is benefits to establish a relationship. So of course the Tyrrell model doesn't either has a permanent relationship or constant rematch, but you could be in between where you continue a relationship or not. So if the relationship persists, contract will change over time as individual relationships get established. Reputation are valuable, and temporary shocks can have long-lasting implications. So think about tainted milk. Firm may exert costly action to preserve a good reputation. So for example, the pen thing, where you are refunding the upfront payment for maintaining your reputation to be generally a good person, an easy person to deal with. There is a value in networks. So you might have the emergence of network in order to allow the flow of information to circulate faster. Network will increase X, and network can also increase the penalty from default by adding social punishment to any firms at default. So network might emerge in equilibrium. Any question on that, or we should look at some data?